Well, hello, everyone.
Hello.
Barry, many thanks for the kind introduction. And Nick, it is always absolutely a pleasure to speak after Nick because I find myself far more educated than I was before he spoke, so I always enjoy that as well. As I thought about this evening and thought about Barry's title, it occurred to me that, not surprisingly, I really had more questions than answers. And so part of what I wanted to do was to share with you tonight some of my overall questions, and maybe together we can begin to think about some answers. And the questions, in part, each surprised me a little bit because I thought some of them were actually settled. And so the three that I really think about, the issue here is how much should government subsidize homeownership? But I find myself thinking about what's government, what's subsidy, and frankly, what's homeownership? Because I actually think every single one of those subjects is up for grabs at the moment, right? So if we think about the question of what's government, and hang on a minute while I untangle here. Okay, that's better. The question today is, well, we know part of what government is, right? We know it as an executive branch, and we know it as a legislative branch, we know it as a judicial branch, we know it as a Congress and a Supreme Court and a president. But what about all those other things that are actually having an enormous impact on housing prices and on the housing market, right? What about the Federal Reserve? Government? Well, not really, a little bit government, kind of quasi-government, but in fact it has an enormous impact on the money supply, and it has an enormous impact on interest rates, right? Not really government. I was thinking about this the other day. If I were President Obama, I wonder how I'd feel if I realized that the most significant lever that I had was actually in somebody else's hands, right? And then you think about the GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Are they government? Not really clear. They're not one of those three branches. That's pretty clear, right? But they are backed by the full faith and credit of the federal government. The government doesn't really control them, except when they get into trouble. We put a conservatorship in place, and apparently the head of that conservatorship needs to be approved by the Congress. Is that control? I'm not sure. So there are various sort of interesting pieces here in which government isn't just the three branches that we always thought about, right? It is also now including all of these kind of quasi-partially, maybe guaranteed, maybe not guaranteed things that it turns out have an enormous impact on the housing market, on housing prices, on liquidity for sure, and on interest rates. Then I thought about the question of what's subsidy, right? Well, we sort of think we know what subsidy is, right? The Section 8 subsidies that people get for rent and so forth, or you might think about the low-income housing tax credit, right? That's another thing that we know of as subsidy. But think about all of the other kinds of subsidy that really impact housing, right? First, there's the mortgage interest subsidy, right? Now, we may not think about that as a subsidy. I think most folks with a mortgage think of it as a God-given right. You get to deduct that mortgage and interest, and that's the beginning, middle, and end of it. But it's not. It in fact, is a subsidy for anybody who's engaged in homeownership. Think about the exemption on capital gain on sale. Why is that, right? If you sell a stock, even a stock you've held for a long period of time, there's a capital gain on that stock. But if you sell a home, there's a big chunk of that home that actually is excluded from the capital gain. Think about depreciation. Why do we depreciate homes? And what does it do? It actually encourages people to renovate, repair, maintain, put a new deck on, and add a guest room, and stick a porch in the front, right? Why do we subsidize that? Because again, depreciation is simply another way of reducing taxes, and whether you're actually putting cash into people's pockets or reducing their expense by reducing tax, either way, it really is a subsidy. And what about the guarantees for Fannie and Freddie? Aren't those effectively subsidies? I mean, the GSEs really create liquidity in the housing market. In addition to Nick's point about really creating a housing market, if we didn't have those liquidity vehicles, I suspect very few people in this room and very few people around the Commonwealth would be able to have access to capital to own a home, no matter what they are, right? And so what level of subsidy is it to say that if the GSEs get into trouble, government is going to bail them out? Right? And then there are questions about what return should you get for the subsidy that you provide? And if you assume that subsidy has an intent, right, we don't just kind of hand out cash for no reason at all. There's supposed to be some purpose in there, whether the purpose is encouraging home ownership or encouraging lower income folks to be able to buy a home or encouraging higher income suburbs. I mean, whatever it is that you think the right goal of subsidy is, there is supposed to be a return for that, right? And so, for example, think about the money that went into the mortgage industry and the lending industry under TARP. That's a subsidy of sorts. It's a subsidy that is directly connected to housing. What return did we get for that? What return should we have gotten for that? Did we even have a conversation about what the return is for that? So, as I said, the initial question around what's government, and then the ongoing question around what's subsidy, I think are really key to the conversation, and I'm not sure we ever include very much about those subjects within the conversation. And then I want to talk a little bit about the kind of subsidy that happens that doesn't go directly into housing, but is really indirect. Think about all of the infrastructure that we put into place. Think about, it's fall now, right? So they're all putting new roads down and fixing potholes and taking the trees off the power lines for this last snowstorm. And all of that really supports the ability of housing to be constructed and the ability of communities to be built. Think about zoning laws and subdivision laws, right? All of which govern that. And in fact, there's lots and lots of money, whether it's on the federal side or the state side, or even the local municipality side, that really supports the development of housing over time. And then, as Barry was indicating earlier, there are a whole lot of other industries that are supported as a result of our focus on housing, right? I mean, I suppose in a different kind of world, we could all live in very cramped quarters in very small areas, and we could share bathrooms and kitchens and outdoor areas and so forth. And certainly there have been periods in the history of this country when large populations did live that way. We don't today. But if you think about what really is embedded in that, there are subsidies to the steel manufacturers and the appliance makers and forest products and sawmills and standing timber, and the list obviously goes on. So I don't think the question is even how much subsidy should happen or whether the government should subsidize. The question really is, what is the subsidy? Have we identified not just the apparent ones that people complain about, those Section 8 subsidies to poor people, but all of the other subsidies that are really embedded in the market, embedded in the way middle-class people live and higher income people live, and frankly in the way business operates and in the way the financial institutions operate. So I guess, as I said, the first question is expanding this idea of what government is and really questioning whether we have the right kind of controls in place over these quasi-governmental entities that actually have such a big impact on the market. And then the second question, I think, is really expanding the conversation around subsidies so that we actually include not just the direct things that we often hear about, but actually all of these, I think, really important indirect subsidies. Now, I completely agree with Nick and with Barry that one of the critical issues here is a level playing field, and that whatever it is that we do to housing, we really have to do it in a way that is consistent across communities and across income levels. And of course, that's not always been the case, right? I mean, we are still paying today for the legacy of the old GI Bill and the racially discriminatory aspects of housing finance at that time. And you can still see that playing out across both differing levels of home ownership among communities of color versus white communities, and differing interest rates as well. So where I get to with all of this, and again, this is going to get into the question of what's home ownership, right? It leads to the question of what the role of government should be in the current foreclosure crisis. And it seems to me that one of the things we've seen coming out of government are these various modification programs, right? We've got HARP, HEMP, and HEMP. I can't even keep all the initials straight. It's hard to keep all the particulars of them straight. But it seems to me that there are a couple of things that ought to be included in those kinds of modifications that we don't really see there. And the reason I think government ought to be playing a role in saying what those modifications are is because, as I indicated earlier, through subsidy, government is actually making an enormous investment, not just in housing, not just in mortgages, but really in the industries that finance these undertakings. And I think I would argue that there has been insufficient focus on government's part to say, hey, wait a minute, you guys don't exist without us, and therefore you really do have some obligations here. And if I were to talk about, when I think about some of the questions about what modifications should do, there are really three things I think about, right? One is that we need to reduce monthly housing expense, and I think for a lot of the modifications currently in play, that's really the focus. The second piece, though, I think, is trying to put a floor under housing prices, because part of the problem now, there's no focus at all, in my view, on stemming the tide of foreclosures, and so long as that tide continues, housing prices continue to spiral downward. And so whatever investment the government is making is really getting lost in this question of spiraling, downward spiraling housing prices. But the third piece that I think is really important goes to this question of what's home ownership. Because I think the third was, first one being reduce monthly housing expense, the second one being putting a floor into housing prices, but the third one really is keeping borrowers who are homeowners as homeowners, right? As true homeowners. So let's unpack that for a second and think about what homeownership is, right? I mean, people buy homes for a number of different reasons. Partly they buy them to have a place to live. They buy because they like the community that the home is located in. They buy because that's a destination for them. They appreciate the schools that are there, the elder services, or the location, whatever it happens to be. But people also buy homes for an investment, right? And they buy homes because it gives them the opportunity to build equity. As Nick said, really to build wealth. And in fact, the purchase of a home is generally the single most significant, most important investment that any individual, any household, any family makes over the course of their economic lives, right? So when you think about what's happening with respect to some of the modifications, and I can just explain a couple of them. For example, one, I think this is Freddie's current modification. They say, okay, we'll reduce housing price, we'll reduce your current monthly housing expense down to 31% of gross income. That deals with my first point, it reduces monthly housing expense, right? Doesn't do anything for putting a floor under housing prices. And what it really doesn't do is to leave the homeowner in a position as homeowner, because what happens to the money that's not paid? Well, it gets added to the back end. And so what happens is monthly housing expense is reduced, but the mortgage period tends to be extended to 40 years, and then there's a balloon on the back end. And so, you know, for all the money you didn't pay during the first 40 years, right? Now, if I'm a homeowner and I say, well, all right, I'm paying less than what I was paying before, perhaps, and I still have a home to live in, those things are good, right? But why on earth would I invest $1 into this home? Because, in fact, at the end of the day, I'm not going to have $1 out of it. The level to which home prices would need to rise in order to give me equity after I pay this thing for 40 years and after that balloon comes due is astronomical. It goes well beyond any kind of increase we've ever seen, right? And so what we wind up with are homeowners who are homeowners in name only. Now they're still responsible for mowing the lawn, they're still responsible for paying taxes, but they have absolutely no equity interest in the home. And not only don't they have an equity interest, but they have no ability to ever get an equity interest in the home. And so the idea that they are therefore going to repair that home, maintain the home, add a new bedroom onto it, support the construction industry, put in new carpeting, whatever it is, why on earth would you do it? I mean, in fact, what most people would do in that circumstance, I think, is to say, you know what, I'm going to live here till the thing falls apart, and then I'm going to move on. And so if you think about going back to my second point, whether that puts a floor into housing prices, I don't really think so. I think what that gets us to is blight, right? Because what you have are a whole group of neighborhoods in which people are not saying, I'm going to maintain my home because at the end of the day I can take value out of this, and so I can have some pride in this. What they're really saying is, I get to sit here as an owner in name only, but really I'm a renter, right? So this whole question of really what does it mean to be a homeowner is now coming into play. And then, you know, when we look at what's happening, and I think folks know REO inventory. REO is our properties that have already gone into foreclosure. It's called real estate owned. Sometimes it used to be called OREO, right? Other real estate owned. But really what it is are all of those homes that have gone through foreclosure that somebody owns. And back in the middle of September, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, which is the conservatorship for Fannie and Freddie, put out a request for information in which they asked people for ideas about what to do with this gigantic glut of homes. And it was clear from the way the questions were asked and the surrounding press and so forth that really what they were looking for was a rental solution. And that really what they wanted was this idea that large investment funds, potentially national investment funds, would buy up whole portfolios of housing that used to be owned by homeowners and would now be turned into rental housing. And in fact, we would turn an entire segment of the population who used to be homeowners into renters. Now, the first problem with that, of course, goes back to this question of a level playing field. It's not a very level playing field. There's an entire segment of the population that's been turned into renters. But the second question, I think, goes more to this point of what's the subsidy, right? Because in fact, there will be an implicit subsidy in the sale of these homes to large investment funds, right? Because the price at which the homes are sold will not necessarily be a price that you or I could go out and buy that home for today. And so we're back to the question, not of whether the government should subsidize, but really of what the purpose of that subsidy is. Think of subsidy as investment. What is it that we're actually buying for that investment, right? And then I think the final point I want to talk about here, and then maybe I'll spend a moment talking about a little bit about what we're doing to try and get by this, is really to think about the other costs to government. I think, and in that sense, when I say government, I mean the sovereign, and that means really us, all of us in this room, right? Because I think one of the great challenges when people think about foreclosure is, and think about mortgages, is somehow they think about them as isolated from the rest of our economic lives, right? Like there's the mortgage over here, and then over here is your car and your education loan and the cost of food and all the rest of that stuff. And the truth is, they're not separated at all, really. They're really tightly tied in together. And the costs of foreclosure are not just cost to a mortgagee or cost to a family, or even cost to that block in which the home is located. The costs of foreclosure are something that every single person in this room pays. Because the more homes that are foreclosed upon, the more evictions that follow, the more vacant homes that we have, the higher the crime rate, the bigger the risk for arson, and the more housing prices drop, the more pressure on real estate taxes, right? So this idea that somehow mortgages stand out there by themselves and the only thing we should think about is subsidy on the mortgage, to my way of thinking, doesn't make any sense. Really, we've got to look at this in a much more holistic way and say, truly, what is the cost to the body politic of having a foreclosure crisis, of having all these homes in foreclosure, of taking all these folks who are supposed to be homeowners and turning them into renters, and how does all that work? And when that analysis is done, I think that we are not better served by kicking homeowners out of their homes. We're not better served by turning homeowners into renters. And we're certainly not better served by having this kind of ersatz homeownership where your name's on a deed, but in fact, you really have no equity interest in the home and no ability to achieve an equity interest. And so I'll take just a second, if I can, to talk a little bit about what we're doing, which I'm hoping runs in the other direction, although I will tell you, we're a substantial nonprofit at this point, but you know, I say when it comes to it, not to pick at my friends at Bank of America, but we're a rounding error, right, when it really comes to a significant financial institution. So, you know, so partly I'm saying we're trying to do this, but really, if you ask me what I think should happen, it's that the government or really the financial industry ought to pick this up. What we've got going is a thing we call the SUN initiative. SUN stands for Stabilizing Urban Neighborhoods. And what it is, as far as we can tell, the only initiative of its kind in the country, which is really aimed at keeping homeowners in foreclosure in their homes, right? And so what we do is, when we find homeowners who perhaps can't afford the mortgage that they had when the bubble went, because it was based on the price at the top of the bubble, but who can afford a mortgage at current market rates, we bring that homeowner in, we underwrite them just like everybody always did before 2005. And this notion that you don't underwrite people is a very short-lived notion, and I think a big piece of the problem that we have. If in fact we can underwrite people to the point where they can afford a home at current market prices, we turn around to the lender or the REO holder, whoever has control over that mortgage, and we attempt to buy the home back at a steeply discounted price. And if we can succeed at that, we turn around and we sell the home right back to the homeowner, right? Now there are some bells and whistles in this to assure that we keep speculators out of the mix and that there are enough loan loss reserves and appreciation is shared. You know, one of the things we do is we collect, if there's future appreciation, some of it will come into our nonprofit, which is aimed at investing out in the neighborhoods, because we think that equity belongs in the neighborhoods. We don't think it ought to go out to investors. I sometimes say that another way to describe the mortgage crisis is it's the sound of equity whooshing out of the neighborhoods, right? So whether it's with a particular family or not, we think that equity belongs in the neighborhoods. But what we do is we're able actually to reduce monthly housing expense by better than 40%. And we actually can also reduce mortgage principal by better than 40%. And so at the end of the day, the homeowner is actually left with a monthly payment that they can afford, and they're left with the potential for equity in the home, right? Now that's two of my three criteria. The third is putting a stop under spiraling housing prices. I'm not certain what we're doing is succeeding at that because we're tiny at the moment. But I actually think if you could get folks back to a place where they had that kind of equity, you could succeed at that. The challenge in this is we often get folks, and it's not just private lenders, but it's folks like Freddie Mac or folks like FHA who say, oh no, we're not going to work with you. We will accept your offer, and now we're going to make you sign an affidavit that says you'll never sell this home back to the homeowner. I said, well, we're going to sign that affidavit, right? And so they say, well, then we're not going to sell you the home. And so you say to yourself, why is it that really, you know, folks who in my way of thinking ought to know better are talking about refusing to allow us to sell homes back to the homeowner? Well, they say, moral hazard. After all, if we help these folks in foreclosure, okay, who we all know are responsible for this problem themselves. It wasn't a failure of regulation, it wasn't Wall Street, it wasn't products that were, that people knew or should have known would cause harm. It was all the bus drivers and the mechanics and the school secretaries who were supposed to be financial experts for the moment of their mortgage, right, who went out and did this thing. And so essentially what they say is, if we help those folks, then everybody else will stop paying their mortgage. Well, the only problem with that is, there are two problems with that, right? One is, being in foreclosure ruins your economic status, right? You can't get a car loan, you can't get a house loan, you can't even rent an apartment without a landlord saying, put up a pile of money here, right? Because you don't have the good credit, right? But also, there's actually no evidence at all that people stop paying their mortgage because we help people in foreclosure. It's like the old thing about, Ronald Reagan and the welfare queen. All of a sudden they had a whole bunch of people parading around as welfare queens. Or the idea that death taxes kill the family farm, right? I mean, we never find any of those either. But these things kind of catch on, and all of a sudden, it's become a policy, right? And it's not just become, as I say, a financial institution policy, it's become a government policy. We've got the FHA saying, oh no, we can't possibly sell back to you if people are storing their homes. So, I'm going to just wind up here, but to leave you with the questions about, we really need to think about the many, many, many ways in which we invest and the intended and unintended consequences of that investment. But frankly, before we even get to the unintended consequences, I would really encourage a national conversation, which I certainly hope we can start here today, really about what we'd like the consequences to be. Because maybe if we had some understanding about really where we intended to go with respect to the investment that we make, that we call subsidy, we'd be able to have a more rational conversation about the housing crisis and the foreclosure crisis, and it would sound more like an economics conversation and less like a morality play. So, thanks very much.